The Thursday, April 25th, 2019 regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission will now come to order. May I have roll call, please?
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Gooding?
Here.
Commissioner Mackin?
Here.
Commissioner Patel?
Here.
Commissioner Saison?
Here. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
I make a motion. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Consent calendar. Is there anyone who would like to remove an item from the consent calendar? I see no one. May I have a motion to adopt, please?
I move that we adopt the consent calendar as is.
Any second?
I second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Oral communications. Is there anyone here who would like to address the commission about an item that's not on tonight's agenda? I see no one. Written communications. We have quite a few here. The first is a reminder about the Saturday, May 4th community conversation at Mission Blue at 2:30 p.m. And there'll be a nacho bar, and the community is invited to join and take part in the workshop. The second is from the Housing Leadership Council, and it's regarding the Affordable Housing Week mixer from May 3rd through the 10th. Third is a write-up regarding the highlights from Brisbane's March 21st community conversation. And also we have several letters here regarding the public hearing that we will be having tonight, and I'll address these later. Okay, so the new business is a public hearing that I just mentioned. It concerns 296 San Benito Road, R-1 Residential District, a variance V-1-19 and grading review EX-1-19. Again, this concerns a variance and grading review to allow demolition of an existing single-family home and construction of a new 1,794.5 square foot single-family home on a 2,300 square lot, exceeding the maximum permitted floor area ratio by approximately 138.5 square foot, and requiring export of 95 cubic yards of soil from the site. The applicant is Jerry Cool, and the owners are Paul and Glenda Jimenez. Staff, may we have a report?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good evening, Commission. So the requested permit is for variance and grading review to allow construction of a new single-family dwelling of approximately 1,794 net square feet at 296 San Benito Road. The variance is required to allow the home to exceed the maximum floor area for the property by about 138 square feet, and the grading permit is required to allow approximately 95 cubic yards of soil cut and export from the site. So just to orient you to the property, it's located at the corner of San Benito Road and Glen Park Way. This is showing the San Benito frontage. You can see there's currently no curb cut, and looking from Glen Park Way, you can see the existing curb cut, which provides one uncovered parking space at the rear of the existing home. And you can also see, oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Gomez, you have to recuse yourself.
Yes. You want that in the record? I must formally recuse myself from voting. Oh, I need to leave the room. Oh. Well, then I shall leave. I didn't know that. News flash. Okay. I shall leave. Where do I hang out? Just go. Look at my smartphone. Okay.
Don't forget to come back.
I was looking at a photo of the house next to the property, and it reminded me. Sorry about that. So going on. So construction of the new home would require demolition of the existing structure, which is shown here, single story, about 1,000 square feet. The property itself is substandard in size as well as width and depth. So the lot size is 2,300 square feet, and we have on the screen here the proposed site plan. So the site plan shows the proposed new driveway, which would require a new 18-foot curb cut on San Benito Road. So again, that would be that frontage there. The driveway would, in addition to the curb cut, there'd also be new sidewalks in that portion, which currently there are none on that side of San Benito. So quite a lot of frontage improvements on the San Benito frontage. The driveway would accommodate 2 compact-sized cars, and they would also provide compliant landscaping as well as a stairway to access the home in the front yard setback. And here is an excerpt from the applicant's plans, the floor area ratio diagram. So this illustrates how we're measuring floor area for this structure. So as the staff report discusses, there is a credit, a floor area ratio credit or reduction for substandard lots, so less than 3,700 square feet in lot area. We allow up to 200 square feet of garage or covered parking area to be deducted from the floor area. So this diagram shows how that's applied. So the proposed home would be 3 levels. The first level accommodating a about 473 square foot garage, so larger than the minimum for a 2-car garage. And the applicant has drawn that 200 square foot reduction on the floor plan to make that clear what's getting not counted towards the floor area. There would also be some living space on the ground floor, living space above, and then a 3rd story accommodating master bedroom. So all in all, with the 200 square foot reduction for the parking, we're looking at, it says 1793.25 on the screen, it's 1794.5 is that net floor area. So the gross floor area would be about 1994. And here's some elevation side view, the north elevation, which would be the San Benito, as seen from the San Benito frontage, and east as seen from Glen Parkway. And then as for the grading, so the property does have a slight slope as it moves up towards up Glen Parkway. So you can see here the proposed section going longwise on the property, showing where that cut is going to occur. So no retaining walls are proposed other than a landscape wall that doesn't even meet our building permit requirement. Okay, so moving on to the variance findings. So in order to approve the requested variance, Commission has to find that because of special circumstances applicable to the property, so that could be topography, size, dimensions, shape, the strict application of the zoning ordinance would deprive the property of privileges enjoyed by other properties in the vicinity in the same zoning district. If the variance is approved, it has to be subject to conditions to ensure that it's not a grant of special privilege, that you're not just giving someone a special privilege. So based on the analysis presented in the staff report, which we'll go over briefly, in regards to special circumstances, so this is a small lot. It's 2,300 square feet, again, not standard in depth or width for the R1 district standards. In looking in the vicinity, staff did a survey of the 200 block of San Benito and the 100 block of Glen Parkway. So what's shown here, we were trying to get an idea of what kind of lot sizes we're looking at in the surrounding area. So the scatter chart in the staff report and up on the screen here plots out for all of those parcels that are selected in that vicinity map, shows their actual size. So, you know, quite a few, not unusual in a lot of parts of Brisbane, quite a few lots are under 5,000 square feet. So 5,000 square feet is the standard lot size. However, as we know, we have a lot of, the old subdivision lots were 25 by 100, and some lots are even smaller. So as you can see on their scatter chart, there are 5, not 4. As I said in my staff report, there are 5 properties in the vicinity that are less than 2,500 square feet, one of which is the subject property. The others all kind of hover around between 3 to 5, with 1 or 2 going just over that. So in general, the subject property, while it is small and substandard in size, there are other lots that are similarly or even more non-conforming in the vicinity. So in regards to special circumstances, we're not finding that its size is a particularly special circumstance when looking at other properties in the vicinity. The second part of the findings talks about privileges denied to this property that are otherwise enjoyed by other properties in the same in the vicinity under the same zoning regulations. So, as noted on the floor plan, the floor area variance is requested primarily to accommodate an additional parking space beyond the one space that's required by the parking ordinance. So, for any house that's 1,800 square feet or less in living area, the parking requirement is one covered car, could be a carport or garage, and one uncovered car. So in this case, the living area is about 1,500 square feet, so that would meet that lower parking standard. The garage as designed would exceed the minimum requirements even for a 2-car garage. So in our design standards in the parking code, the dimensions for a 2-car garage are 20 by 20. So on the floor plan for the garage, it's showing just a little bit over 20 in each direction, so about 473 square feet. So that not only is it over the area for a 2-car garage, but it's also, again, exceeding the area for covered parking by about just under 300 square feet. So in this instance, the R1 district regulations have that 200 square foot reduction, basically recognizing that substandard lots get penalized a lot more from a floor area perspective than standard lots. We'd rather have more living space, and not have people be penalized because they also have to provide space for their cars. So the R1 district standard applies uniformly to any lot under 3,700 square feet, including this one. And provision of a 2-car garage where it's not otherwise required by the parking ordinance, while otherwise maximizing the living space, isn't necessarily a privilege enjoyed by their substandard lots in the area. So for that finding, the analysis found that it wasn't meeting that test either. And then in regards to any conditions necessary to prevent a grant of special privilege, because staff didn't find it was meeting the first 2 criteria, we did not address that criteria as it's not applicable. Moving on to the grading, the grading is fairly limited. Any redevelopment of this site would likely require this amount of grading or similar. Soil cut and export specifically to accommodate a home. There are no large exposed retaining walls, no trees being removed. It's also not in the Habitat Conservation Plan area. So with that, staff is recommending denial of the variance and recommend the city engineer issue the grading permit subject to conditions of approval, including redesign of the project to comply with the R1 standards via adoption of the 2 resolutions attached to your staff report. So that concludes the presentation. I'm happy to answer questions if there are some.
Thank you. Questions, Commissioner Gooding?
Yes, thank you. Just want to clarify some facts that I think were sort of buried in here, but I want to make sure I understand. That this building does meet the height limitations of the R1 zoning, correct?
Yes, as designed, height, setbacks, any other development standard has been complied with, lot coverage. It's just the floor area that is not.
And does the project as proposed change any of sort of the footprint of the structure with regard to setback requirements and distance from sidewalks and such?
I can show the existing survey that shows how the existing structure sits on the lot, if that would be helpful. But, I mean, are you asking if there are existing nonconformities that might be remedied by rebuilding?
No. Thank you for the clarification. This doesn't, I believe, from my looking at it, it didn't increase the footprint of the project. Is not bigger on the lot than the current building is, just looking at it sort of vertically. It's not eating up any setbacks or anything like that.
I'll refer to the staff report.
Sure.
To the project description, which has a summary of existing versus proposed. So your attachment D. So it looks like right now it's actually a little over lot coverage, the lot coverage maximum. So the proposed design would have a smaller footprint, a compliant footprint. So currently the structure has a 47% lot coverage, which is non-conforming.
But their proposed project would actually reduce that?
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. And has there been any comments or complaints or negative feedback from any of the immediately surrounding neighbors?
As the chair mentioned, we got comment letters, and I should have referenced them specifically, but you should have letters of support received from Nancy Laxamana, Luc Bouchard, Dolores Gomez. That's it.
And those are all
Those are in support.
support.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you, Edith. That's all.
Commissioner Mackin, you have any questions?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Patel?
I do.
Okay.
Can you, sorry, I'm going to ask some really basic questions. Can you explain FAR to us?
Sure. So floor area ratio is a number that you arrive at by dividing the floor area of a structure by the size of the lot.
Okay. And when you were saying that because this is a substandard lot, you subtract some of the floor area when you're creating that ratio. Is that right?
Right. If they're only if they're providing parking. So if someone proposed a structure without a garage, they're not getting a 200 square foot reduction. But if they design it with a garage, they can subtract up to 200 square feet of that garage from their total floor area calculation.
And then that's expressed as a ratio.
Yes.
Okay. And so that sort of equalizes plots in terms of square foot of the building versus the lot area on a certain block or blocks as you put it.
I don't know what you mean by equalizes, but I mean, the idea of a floor area ratio is that it is sensitive to the specific size of a lot, right? So it doesn't create a uniform kind of bulk and mass.
Mm-hmm.
It's all relative to how big the lot is.
Right. So it's a ratio of the square feet of the proposed building or the building
Right.
divided
To the
by
size of the lot.
Okay.
Yeah. So the 200 square foot reduction, so for the specific proposal, for example, it's really 1994 square feet, right? That's actually what it is.
Mhm.
But for compliance with zoning, we allow 200 square feet to be deducted from that. So, you know, the house itself, the actual floor area isn't 1794, but for compliance with zoning purposes, that is what it is.
So when you when staff created the chart with the various FARs for different buildings on San Benito as well as Glen Park,
Mm-hmm.
you would, when it's 0.78, I mean, you would take all of the substandard lots and then subtract the 200 square feet for parking if it applied or whatever, and then that's how this is graphed, right?
For lots that were less than 3,700 square feet in size that had garages, correct?
So, have we made variances before for at least 2 different properties on this particular block before?
Are you referring to the FARs that are over a 0.72?
Mm-hmm.
For those particular properties, no. That is just their existing condition. Many homes were built prior to regulations coming into effect that, you know, they would currently be considered non-conforming, but not illegal. They're legal non-conforming.
Okay, so those are 2 lots. Those 2 properties have been quote unquote grandfathered in because they were built before regulations.
So, or specifically, in answer to your question, there are no variances on file for those 2 properties. That appears to be the way they've been for quite a long time, and they don't need variances to legalize the condition that they're in.
Okay.
Thank you. I have no questions, so I will open it up for the public hearing. Would the applicant like to come up and speak?
Hi, my name is Jerry Cool. I'm the designer on the project. The first thing I'd like to say is thank you for your work on your report. We came up with a slightly different conclusion. The main issue I'd like to bring up is, yes, there are 2 homes within this area that are over the standard floor area ratio. One in particular, 276, San Bruno, which was built in 2001, currently has a floor area ratio of, at the best count, is 0.93%, or 93%. This one also has a 2-car garage in it, and it was built this way. The plans dated on, what am I looking at? In September, or on 5/16/99, show that the building itself is 1960 square feet on an 1890 square foot lot. So I'm assuming that the square footage reduction was applied to this. Otherwise, the floor area ratio would have been over 100%, which I find it difficult that they would have agreed to this. So what we're seeing is that my client is being denied something that in the actual neighborhood is being enjoyed by some of the neighbors. Also, the building itself is not out of scale for the neighborhood. There are plenty of buildings around that are this size. They are on larger lots, but this is not particularly large for any of the area. Do you have any questions in particular?
Does anyone have questions for the applicant? No.
I don't.
Yeah, so my main issue was, yes, we feel that there is a subject property within the study group that they have brought up that does meet the standards that we're trying to propose. And ours is considerably considerably smaller. We're only asking for 140 square feet, whereas, they had a 93% floor area ratio on this house. And there is one other house, as you noticed, that was, 78%, which is what we're looking for.
I do have a question.
Okay, Commissioner Patel.
How would your plans change if you were to make it conforming? How would the plans of your building change?
We'd have to look at that. Obviously anything's possible, but, this is what we came up with. We looked at the neighborhood, we saw what was going on, we figured that this was a reasonable request to get more cars off the street. My clients want to keep their cars in the garage. They don't like having them out on the street. He likes to work on them. He likes to have the space. Also, the garage is slightly smaller. If you've ever been in a 20 by 20 garage with 2 full-size cars in it, it's very difficult to get around. So I typically make the garages a little larger in order to give people space for movement. And that way it also gives them a little storage.
Commissioner Gooding?
Yeah, I think you answered my question preemptively. I was going to ask what the motivation or thinking was behind the notion in this project of increasing the garage space, essentially. Basically, as I see it, what creates your need to ask for a variance is the increase in garage space.
Yes, we're actually, we only need 1 spot, a covered spot for this.
Right.
So we want to add 2 spots. And we noticed that, there is a representative that isn't in the area, so we figured it was logical.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I have requests from the audience to speak. So, Tony Press.
Hello, thank you very, very much. I live on 64 Sierra Point Road. I've been in Brisbane since 2012 and been a homeowner since 2017 on Sierra Point Road now, and I love living here. I was alerted to your hearing today by Luc Bouchard, and I read very carefully what he had written, and I was very impressed by it. I just wanted to put in my 2 cents. I actually sent an email, but it probably came in too late this afternoon. What moves me the most is the idea about the parking and taking the cars off the road, especially right there by the school, but anywhere. I walk in town, try to get my 10,000 steps in every day. I'm very lucky I have time to do that, but I think it would be really valuable at very little price to allow these people who I actually don't know, I met them tonight, to get the cars off the road. I think that's one of the big issues in our town for pedestrians, for school children, adults and children, and also for drivers, is to have as much public space available and have cars on private spaces. So I urge you to accept the variance. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you. Mr. Luc Bouchard?
Good evening, Madam Chairperson, Commissioners, City staff, and fellow Brisbane residents. Luc Bouchard, Brisbane resident. It's a pleasure and a privilege to address you, and thank you for hearing my comments. I'd like to mention one thing right off the bat. You may wonder why I so support the Jimenez family in this. I've mentioned in my letter that I'm friends with the family for 15 years and have befriended 3 generations represented here tonight. And this is despite my being French Canadian and a Habs fan, and Paul is a Sharks fan. So despite that, I still support them. That shows you that all my appreciation is anchored in the merits of this project, in my view. What the Jimenez family is trying to do essentially is the proverbial doing more with less. And in fact, they're doing more than that. Not only are they, in my view, and I think in an objective view, providing a service to themselves. I mean, it makes sense to go for something that benefits you when you ask for it. But I think no one would complain about an extra car being taken off the street. And something that I did not realize until a few moments ago when Commissioner Gooding asked the question is that the replacement of the current structure by the new structure would actually improve yet one other dimension of the project, which is that the surface area covered by a building would actually become conforming or compliant, I guess is the term, whereas right now it's not. So if I'm an innocent bystander or a neighbor, somebody walking down the street, and I see the current structure, it is bigger in either width or depth, and I've not studied the topic, but you know, it is bigger than what it should be currently. Tearing it down, building the new project as proposed would reduce either the width or the depth. Again, I don't know which parameter, but it would make it conformant on its top-down view, as per your question of earlier. So I think that's a positive, an extra positive of the project. I think this, you know, the eventual granting of this variance comes at no cost to anybody. I don't see how this project could be modified to benefit anyone, just to shrink the livable space. If you look at the project, the 3rd story, if memory serves, is where the master bedroom will be located. It's a nice bedroom, but it's not you know, ostentatiously large. So one could consider that they would you know, if they reduce the size of it, they could keep the exact same footprint of the building on the ground, the same width, the same depth, the same setbacks, and be compliant to all the other dimensions of the project and the requirements of the project, have a smaller bedroom, and from the street, I would see a 2-car garage still, right? So one thing I want to highlight, in my view, I see that staff underpins its argument to deny the variance based on the following sentence, which is, if I understand correctly, my apologies for having lost, oh, there you go. The ability to provide a 2-car garage where it is not required by the parking ordinance, while otherwise maximizing living space, is thus not a privilege enjoyed by other substandard lots in the R1 district. It seems to me, and I could stand to be corrected, that the argument here to deny is to say, okay, it's not just that the FAR is bigger than what it should be. It's the way in which we arrive at an FAR that's bigger than it should be, the precise conditions of garage and the reduction of the square footage as allowed by regulations for lots under 37 square feet. I think it's BMC 17640.f. That combination has not yielded another property with an FAR above the 0.72 that's allowed. To me, that's going too deep in analyzing the comparison of who else might have received that privilege. To me, if somebody's going to exceed the FAR, what they do with their square footage or how they arrive at exceeding the square footage, you know, they're trying to do more with less. What they're actually trying to do with it is take an extra car off the street, so I think that's you know, a good idea, and I don't think, you know, causes any harm to anybody. But if we forget about the exact mix of things, then we do see two comparables, one at 0.78 if memory serves, the other one much higher than that. And how these other properties were grandfathered in and what mixture of various, and I'm going to put that between quotes, excesses, that is where they exceeded maybe height or width or depth or living space, I'm not sure, but how they arrived at that is not particularly important to me. So for me, there are two properties where the FAR is higher than the 0.72 that's allowed by regulations. And I think you may find, and in fact I would say one must find, that there are other neighborhoods in the immediate, neighbors in the immediate vicinity who enjoy a privilege, which in this case for the Jimenez family is far from frivolous. Everybody wins, nobody loses. It doesn't come at the expense of anybody else's enjoyment of views or setbacks or safety or anything like that. So I would urge you to consider approving variance B119. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Dennis Boosie? I don't know if I pronounced that right.
Good evening, Dennis Bussey, 40-year resident of Brisbane. I want to speak to the garage and getting a car off the street. I live across from that school. I've owned a property there for 25 years, lived on and off. It is an absolute zoo when the parents or whoever the people are dropping off and picking up kids. They double park, they drive over driveways, including mine, tear out trees I paid to have put in. Anything that can get a car off the street, particularly across the street from the school, you know, 100, 200 feet away, is an asset. And if this hang-up over parking for a few feet extra would be insane to not allow it to go through. Because getting that one car off the street at that intersection where the parents come in and out continually, you go up and hang out there someday, it'll blow your mind. And there's never a cop to correct anything. I also might add, too, that their proposal for a home there might help to justify across the street from their home. 26 homes, 26 families were kicked out and they were bulldozed. If you don't know, there was a street from the school that went down to Alvarado. I forgot the name of it. And they eminent domained all those homes. Some were brand new to build that school. So I think it's time to kind of balance it out. This is a local family who mean well, have shown to prove they're an asset to the town. Bend your rules a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to address the commission on this issue? Okay, I see no one. May I have a motion to close the public hearing?
So moved.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, discussions. Who would like to begin?
May I?
Commissioner Gooding? Oh, sure.
My aging printer died, so I'm borrowing some of the materials from our chair. I have a couple of points to make. First of all, I want to thank the staff very much for their usual and typical, really, really thorough job. I appreciated being sliced and diced every which way for the data, so we got a sense of, you know, where this property sits, if you will, in the numbers and in the impact on the neighborhood and so forth. And I had not appreciated, you know, how many substandard lots we have in the city. It sounds like a bad word, but it sounds like the fact is that when the rules changed, it left a lot of pretty small lots behind on which, you know, families of equal or similar size have to figure out a way to live as best they can. So my sense of this is that the staff has done, you know, a really competent job at telling us, you know, strictly speaking or by a strict interpretation of the rules, this may not be a perfectly compliant project. But I think I've been impressed by the community support of the project, in particular the notion of getting cars off the streets, particularly my kids grew up in Brisbane Elementary in Lippman and drop-offs are traffic nightmares, and whatever reduces that is a public good, for one point. Just from a public policy point of view, it doesn't address the strict requirements of the statute, but for me, it gives a background to how to approach this and whether you want to look at it strictly or less than strictly. I think the issue of special privilege in this particular case is a word that I think this commission can interpret or apply with some discretion or some lenience, perhaps. I don't think providing or creating an extra parking place is a privilege in the sense that the variance statutes contemplate. I think they contemplate, getting more living space, getting a spa in the backyard, increasing your footprint to be bigger on your lot, those kinds of things, which this project doesn't do. So I don't think that this constitutes a grant of privilege in the sense that the statutes about variances contemplate trying to restrict. So, with all due respect, I think that this commission, if we want to, can look at that and say it's not the applicable criterion. The other criterion applied was whether we deprive the property of privileges enjoyed by other properties. I think the fact that this property is smaller gives it a relative disadvantage to its larger, brother and sister properties down the street that are occupied by families in much the same situation as this one, and that by strictly and rigorously applying this particular FAR, we are in fact in some way restricting their privileges or their abilities to use their property compared to others. So I think I'm obviously intentionally trying to find a way around the statute, and I readily admit it, but I think it's for a good purpose in this particular instance, that I can reasonably, I personally, I don't know about my commissioners, could reasonably find that these criteria as to this property do not necessarily apply in as strict a fashion as one could. And I'm, willing and prepared to vote to actually approve the variance in this instance.
Thank you, Commissioner Gooding. Commissioner Patel?
I just have another question for staff based on what Commissioner Gooding just said. What number of square feet would the project have to decrease to make it so it conform to the law?
138.5.
So they could take that 138.5 from any particular room. It wouldn't have to be from the parking.
Right, they just have to reduce
One of somehow.
on either any floor. I won't propose a design solution, but yeah, it doesn't mean you have to take one chunk from one place. You could take many chunks.
So ideally, if the parking was really an issue, just so it would conform to the law, they could potentially somehow try to decrease square footage from a different floor and keep the parking.
Yes, I think the applicant spoke to the particular reason why they designed this project the way they did. But in the words of Mr. Cool, anything is possible. Yes, they don't necessarily have to shave the parking area down to get a compliant FAR.
When we look at granting variances, do we typically look at potentially beneficial aspects of the new development as it relates to privilege, in comparing privilege to other lots in the area?
The findings that Julia laid out in the staff report are, those are directly out of the code. It's up to the commission. That's why you're here, is having a conversation and interpreting what a special circumstance means, what a privilege, enjoyed by others, deprived to the subject property. Those are all open for your sort of discussion and decision ultimately. Commissioner Goodings has a perspective on it, and you may or may not share that, but that's certainly within your purview to interpret all those words as you see fit.
So there's no set definition of privileges enjoyed by others
No.
Okay.
Oh, before I jump too far, and I'll let Julia verify that. I'm not aware of any sort of precise definition of what constitutes a privilege. I don't think there's anything in the zoning ordinance, but we'll verify that before the. If I'm incorrect, Julia will correct me.
If you have other questions, go for it. I'll just be looking.
Commissioner Patel, anything else?
Okay, so as it relates to our conversation, I'm having a hard, I agree with Commissioner Gooding. One, this makes this project a conforming piece of, it makes it a conforming, it conforms to the coverage area for the lot, right? However, I'm having a problem trying to figure out, like, if we grant a variance on this one particular project, then how are we doing our evaluations for future projects? Is there going to be some sort of standard where we say if there's some benefit, then we will allow for a variance that, I mean, is counter to the law that's written? How we do that analysis?
Can I?
No, go ahead, Commissioner Gooding.
Right, I think that's an excellent point, because we don't want to, get on a slippery slope here for other projects and for other reasons. But that's why I was focusing on the terminology of the two criteria used by staff, who I want to repeat again, are doing their jobs, telling us, from a strict interpretation or a standard one, there are issues here, and I totally get that. I think that this is exactly where, commissions are well situated to take the community standards and our sense of what makes sense, to give a little bit of, a skosh more room here and there for things that make sense for the community at large. And so I don't think the way these folks have structured their property or their project is trying to take advantage of any privileges in the sense that I view variance statutes as keeping people from, adding goodies and bonuses and extra stuff to their projects for their own benefit and for their own pleasure and enjoyment of the property, which they're entitled to try to do. But in this case, a parking place is I think an undeniable benefit to the neighborhood and neighbors and community at large, as opposed to, strictly speaking, a privilege unique to them and solely for their purpose. That's why I think that this kind of variance is not like asking for 138 feet for their hot tub or for a gaming room or a pool table or something. It's not that kind of thing. It's not really that kind of privilege, and it may not be a privilege at all, in my opinion. It's a feature of the property that has a whole bunch more good than bad.
Commissioner Mackin, do you have anything?
First of all, I'd like to commend the people that showed up tonight. You obviously have an affection for your neighbors and wanted to speak highly for them. I also want to commend staff. This is a difficult issue, but I'm going to take a little different direction on this. I think there's an attempt here to characterize that if we don't approve this as presented, we're removing valuable parking, and I don't think that's the case. I look at this as there's a lot, there's a demolition, there's a new project. Going into this, I would assume the architect is aware of the FAR regulations and had numerous opportunities to consult with staff. So the fact that we're here, your interpretation of that and what you've brought to us is what you want it to be in comparing to other adjacent or other properties in the area. But that being said, an extremely large garage is, to me, a design decision, because there are numerous ways this could be in complete conformity with the FAR. You could still have a large garage and be in conformity, because as your architect has mentioned, you want a garage for 2 cars plus a lot of storage. But that is your design choice. The difficult part for us is that we are not lacking compassion or saying, oh yeah, I'd just love a huge garage, and I get it. You're trying to get parking, get cars off the street. let's not forget there's space for 2 cars in the driveway outside as well. It's going to take parking off the street, where before you had a single car garage, and I don't even think there was parking in that driveway. Maybe there was. So we're actually, in essence, with even a small 2-car garage, gaining 4 spaces. But I think what, listening to even my fellow commissioners, what's difficult here is that we're not here to make code. And we hear a lot of very compelling arguments from people. And before I was a commissioner, I sat through many planning commission hearings, and I heard about someone saying, we just want to exceed the height limit by 3 feet. There's another house way down the road and they're higher, and there's another one here that's higher. A lot of times the codes were written after those houses were built because someone said there's too many of those. So what we have to work with is the code. It is the rule. And you might say, well, that's just being strict and onerous and you're being officious. But here's the fact. The code is written so it's fair for everyone. Everyone going by the same rules. You can point out another house, it's a little different, something's there. A lot of those were built before that code was in place. If there's someone that got a variance that we don't know about, we're operating on the facts that we have to go by. And it is a very dangerous thing, in my point of view, from what I've seen over some years of planning commission hearings, to see where you grant a privilege, and that's an emotional decision. It's not based on sound fairness. And it sets a precedent. How do we deny the next person? Say, you want your game room and a huge garage for 3 cars. And we go, oh yeah, that's nice, but you gave it to them. And so I would rather that we say the code is the code. If you don't like the code or you think it's no longer applicable in Brisbane, things have changed, or we have a lot of substandard lots. We do. And everybody would love, they say, this is what I can afford. It's my small home, my small lot, and I want to get the most out of it. But sometimes you can't get everything you want on a small lot. You need either a bigger lot or a bigger home. And if you can't afford it, that's what we all face. That's what every applicant coming back before us is going to face. So if this drives a question about whether the code needs to be updated or is not relevant, I think that's a valid issue if the public would like to bring that up. But I think for us as commissioners, we have a very hard decision, because we're not here to please people. We're not here to say, gee, I love those neighbors and I don't want to disappoint them. That's not what it's about. And what we face here is, in granting a variance, we have to have findings. And I don't have findings here, because you can still have a 2-car garage. We're not taking away a garage. It's a design decision that you have a large garage. So we're not preventing a 2-car garage. So I think pretty much I don't have a finding to convince me that this variance falls under the code.
Well, I think everybody has made some very good points. You've made some good points. I mean, I see the community good of, allowing more street parking to be available by allowing the extra garage. And I see what Commissioner Mackin is saying, because, the code is the code and we should follow it strictly. I've been reading through this over and over, trying to rack my brain to see, if there's a way we could approve this variance. And one thing I just want to throw out to all of you, to maybe, if this is something worth considering, is the code does allow us to grant the variance if things such as the size of the property, the location, the surroundings, if we deny it, would deprive the owner of the privileges enjoyed by other properties. So we've heard public testimony that parking there is horrendous. One person described it as a zoo. I mean, does that location make it unique in that because the parking is so bad over there, that if we granted the extra garage, it would alleviate problems for not only the property owner, but the neighbors as well. So, I mean, is there something unique to that location?
May I
Yes.
comment on that? Again, we're not denying a two-car garage. It means they simply have to make an alteration in the rest of their design. And they have the ability to do that. They are opting for a large garage. There is nothing here, that was the question staff answered, that said they can find, correct me if I'm wrong, the square footage somewhere else in this plan and retain that garage. We're not saying you can't have the garage. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask a mathematical question, which follows up on Commissioner Mackin's. If we magically alter the garage from its current proposal to the minimum size two-car garage, how much of that 138 feet do we save?
73. It's 473 now. 400 would be the.
I knew you'd have the answer. Thank you. So there'd still be 60 about 60 feet missing, or overage.
Wait, can you go over that? There'd be 60 feet of overage. What does that mean?
Sorry, even if they reduce the size of the footprint of the garage to the smallest two-car garage that meets codes, they'd still be about 60 feet over the FAR.
They'd have to do a combination, I think.
They'd have to.
Just been trying to work the
They'd have
different.
to take
numbers.
away space someplace else
Right,
in the
like
project,
the,
from the living room or
master-
dining room or
Master
combination
bedroom
of-
or, yeah. Okay, so my question, maybe Commissioner Gooding, is, in response to Commissioner Mackin's comments, we would have to make special findings. What are the findings that you would? What are the findings that you would advocate for?
Through the chair, just sort of a point of order, just for the commission's benefit.
Yes.
You know, you wouldn't, if you wanted to do something other than the staff recommendation and work through sort of findings to support, you would want to continue this matter and provide some general direction in terms of what those findings should be. You don't have to sit here and craft findings this evening in support of a variance. You provide some direction to us as to general intent or what your feelings are about that, and we'll come back with language for you to formally adopt. So don't feel compelled to come up with findings this particular evening. If you're headed that direction, obviously, if you're inclined to support the staff recommendation, that's a different story.
That's really good news, John. Thank you. I think in general, my thumbnail version would be to make or suggest that there are findings that could be made, that the criteria used by the staff in their proposed findings do not strictly speaking apply to this property, because it's not a privilege, and there are other properties in the neighborhood that Sue seem to be able to enjoy because they are larger lots. I get that. The ability to have larger garage spaces. That's the best I can do on the fly. But I think the issue is that I think the criteria need not be applied strictly to this property in the light of the benefits it provides to the neighborhood. Benefits to the neighborhood are not in the variance statute, I recognize, but I think that's the space where we can shoehorn in some discretion as a body to do the best thing for the neighborhood without creating a real dangerous precedent. We make it real clear that it's just that for this, because these substandard lots face these problems all the time, when you have a bunch of you have many different sizes of lots in the same street or the same neighborhood, you know, ratcheting down the FAR for a much smaller lot isn't necessarily the fairest, best thing to do to the owners of that lot. If they're trying to provide something that is, you know, not objectionable. If they were putting up, you know, a giant video screen or a scoreboard, different ballgame. But it's not what we're talking about.
To Commissioner Mackin's point, that's a legislative decision.
I get that we're getting to the edge. I just think we have some wiggle room to try to do something that's sensible for projects that are not doing things for the wrong reasons.
If I may, through the chair. And I understand what Commissioner Gooding, what you're saying. And I understand people want us to be sensible, but are you going to apply this then to every substandard lot that comes back to us that has a floor area ratio problem? That's what I'm saying. I think either you change the code, because you're opening that door then. You are giving a privilege to one, and are you going to deny the next one? That's what I'm asking.
Yep, it's a good question. It's a good question.
Just out of curiosity, staff, if we were to try to change the code, how long would that take to do something like that?
Couldn't do it this evening.
That would take some time because, again, what we've given is a little snapshot of a neighborhood to contextualize this particular request. We'd have to do this citywide because you'd be amending it citywide, and I assume you'd want a lot of data as to what are the implications of doing this citywide, and given current workloads, I wouldn't see this coming back, this kind of amendment, in the near future. And then the council would have to ultimately initiate it as well. It wouldn't be up to the commission.
I think, if I may, one other thing Commission needs to consider is where in Brisbane do you have enough parking that extra parking would not be required? Where in central Brisbane is there enough parking where someone would say, we really don't need a garage at all, or one car garage is fine? I think you could make a pretty good argument that most of central Brisbane people will say, I would really like a two-car garage. So that's my concern about the argument of, well, this area has a particular problem. There's a lot of areas where it's as bad or worse. So I am very concerned that I think fairness is important here. And I see the faces. I have a big heart, and I understand where you're coming from, but what do we do with the next one and the next one? And then we're going to be accused of being unfair. And that's a problem for me.
Oh, Madam Chair, you have a request from the audience to reopen. I guess it would be to reopen the hearing. If someone could ask more questions.
Okay, may I have a motion to reopen? Do I need a motion?
You would need.
Okay, do I have a motion to reopen the hearing? Public hearing.
I'll move that.
Second? All in favor? Aye. Aye. Yes, Mr. Bouchard? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson and Commissioners. I agree with Commissioner Mackin on one fundamental point, is that you are not acting here as a legislative body. You're not writing it as you go. And no one is asking you to do that. In fact, it is the chapter and verse of the Brisbane Municipal Code that when things don't apply exactly, there is a process without rewriting legislation called the variance application. By definition, the variance process is for those things that color outside the line. We are within the letter of the law of the Brisbane Municipal Code. Each variance considered is the possibility of somebody else coming in and saying, that variance you gave to the other guy, I want it too. Likewise, the flip side of the coin is that variance you denied to this other guy. Because you denied it for this other guy, you should deny it for that guy too. Right? It is part of the process. So to me, the suggestion that the only way for a variance to be granted for something that exceeds a certain dimension of the many dimensions that staff and others consider when evaluating a project is to go back to the drawing boards of the actual rules is factually, legally incorrect. The second point I would like to make is Commissioner Gooding, Chairperson Gooding, indicated that though I agree that the way you do consider potentially granting a variance, one of the criteria is to look at, are there other properties that enjoy the privilege that is sought in the variance? That in and of itself is true. However, what the variance application is requesting here is not because others have large garages, they want a large garage too. What we have, I believe, is in the comparative, or the two charts that show of all the properties that were considered in the same zoning district in the same immediate vicinity. If memory serves, there are 5, not 4, as correctly. What's your title? Associate Planner Areas. Thank you. I'm looking at the nameplate. Pointed out it's 5 instead of 4 that are substandard lots. And it is 2 out of I don't know how many that already have a floor area ratio higher than the 0.72 that's being established as the conforming ratio. So the potential finding, for me, personal opinion, the clear finding that you could find is that this property has arrived at an FAR of 0.78. You add 1 square foot on an extremely small lot, the impact of that on your FAR is astronomically bigger than on a conforming lot. Right? You can do the math on this. The smaller the lot, each square foot represents a bigger percentage addition. That's a disadvantage. The smaller the lot, the bigger disadvantage it is. This family, and another thing I absolutely agree with Commissioner Mackin on is that going into the game, so to speak, my word, not yours, I'm not casting aspersions here. They're equipped with professionals on this. Mr. Cool is a very competent designer. They knew all this, right? They knew where the line was. And they chose to create a project that colors outside that line, that crosses it. And that's okay. In our democratic system here in Brisbane, it's okay to do that. And you do that as a judgment call saying, well, we're not going to go for, a TV room with they're not building an ice rink, right? So, is it a huge garage? I don't think so. If it's not a 1-car garage, you can't build a garage for 1.5 cars. You have to build, the next step up is a 2-car garage. The square footage of the garage that they're asking for is not huge compared to the standard for a 2-car garage. It's 473 square feet as opposed to 400 square feet, which is the bare minimum required by regulations. You could not build a 2-car garage at 399 square feet. It would be non-conforming, I think. At 473 square feet, that's approximately, I just did the math, 22 by 22. 2 feet in one direction, 2 feet in that direction. That's not a huge amount of space. It's room to move around the car and the baby carrier and whatever else. So I don't think that we can characterize the requested garage as being an undue imposition on what's allowed, and they're redlining what maybe a variance could allow. I don't think they're pushing it. And the most important point for me was made by Commissioner Gooding, I believe. If the maximum width, considering the setbacks of the property and the maximum depth or length of the building as allowed by the dimensions of the property, and the absolute height, 28 feet, no matter the shape of the property, right? That's actually not true. For a flat lot, it's 28 feet because the slope is flat enough. If they were trying to push that envelope to build a little bit higher or a little bit wider or a little bit longer than what is allowed, then somebody else would pay for the variance they're asking for, because somebody's line of sight would be a little bit more obstructed. There would be a little bit less, room for wildlife or butterflies to go in between 2 houses. Somebody else would have to pay for that. Here, no one has to pay for that. They're not taking anything away from anybody else. They're not being selfish. They're not being selfless. It's an advantage to them. It is a privilege they're requested. They're, you know, I'm eyes wide open on that, and I suspect they are, and everybody else is. But they're not asking for any privilege that comes at the expense of anybody else. In fact, I'm not trying to redesign the project, but if they were to shrink the master suite that they have on the third story of this building by 139 square feet, this discussion is over, we all go home, it's 0.72, nobody has anything to say. And the building is still as wide, still as high, still as deep, it's just that the third story is a little bit smaller. Is there anybody who's going to scream, victory, finally we beat them, they were trying to abuse us and we beat them back? I don't think so. And without going back to the drawing board of
Mr. Bouchard, I'm sorry.
one
Okay.
5 seconds. You have the tool to find that others enjoy an FAR that's higher than what's requested. You have the legal means to say yes or to say no. The decision is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure. Mr. Cool?
I've been a designer in this town a long time. I've done 8 new homes, 70 projects. I'm well aware of what the floor area ratios are supposed to be. So when we were looking at this project, yes. And then once we did the research after the project was designed, it did become clear that there was a house, at least one house in the area, that had a double garage and had a floor area way over the limit at 93%. This told us that this was a possibility, and what we were asking was not a lot. We were just asking a small amount for a little more garage space. Whether I'm assuming that the 200 square foot rule was in effect in 2001. I don't know that to be a fact. Do you, Julia? And so that's kind of where we're coming from. I mean, we're not asking for a lot. We're not asking for the same right that this person was even granted, which was a massive size house with a 2-car garage. We're just asking for just a little more space to make this work for them. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the reason I brought that up is because you kept saying that the larger garage is on larger properties. I just wanted to make sure that we were comparing like properties. They were both substandard lots. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have a motion to close the public hearing again?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, so let's finish up our discussion here. The way I see it, I think we're moving towards, two possibilities here. Either we make directions to staff and continue this for further deliberations, or, based upon what Commissioner Mackin was saying, she made a lot of good points, is, pursuant to the code, and if we were to follow it strictly, we would deny the variance. So, does anybody else have any comments? That's kind of how I saw the two viewpoints. Commissioner Mackin.
So if we go by what the architect, Mr. Cool, has mentioned, the other property that they noticed at the stage of looking at what they wanted to do with it, I question whether you ever went to staff and said, there's this other property. What if we exceed it? Because this would be a precedent. But it seems like that would have been the point to deal with it, or we wouldn't be here tonight.
We knew it would be a variance. I was told it would be a variance. When we first gave it to her, she
Okay.
said we would
Okay, so you did go there. Okay, okay. I'm sorry. I wanted to clarify that because it sounded like that was never done.
No, that was
Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Any further thoughts? Commissioner Patel.
I just want, I would like to continue in one session so that we can address this.
Oh, it's not on.
I would prefer to continue this to one additional session so I could look at what findings we could make to potentially make this project move forward, if any, that would be in conformity with what's written in the Brisbane Code.
Okay, anybody want to make a motion? Do you want to make a motion?
I would move to continue this to our next hearing.
Do you want to provide any other direction to staff, or you just continue it for what purpose? I mean, whether you want us to prepare more information or whether you want to just deliberate at the next meeting. If you want any staff to do anything, it would be good to provide that direction as part of the motion.
What I want to do is actually just want to go through the actual Brisbane code, try to find definitions for special circumstances. I would also like to take a look at whether we can look at the fact that there's substantial benefit to this particular block. There's going to be a sidewalk put in where there is no sidewalk. There's going to be development. Actually, there'll be development on both sides of us with a sidewalk, which will, I think, benefit the community. I'd like to look at all these things before I make a decision. So I don't know if there's anything specific for staff. I just like to think about it for maybe 2 weeks and try to see if I can make some special findings.
I'll second that.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Oppose?
Opposed.
Okay. So the project will be continued to our next meeting,
May 9th.
May 9th.
Does that
May
work
9th.
for the... Can someone represent you?
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Okay, next is, where is? Where's my, can I have your, I've lost my agenda. Thank you. Oh, do I need to read it?
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Glad to be back. Three weeks of the economy.
Wish I had
Not
that,
joking.
I wish I had that kind of plan.
3 weeks of the economy.
I'm about 8 behind.
I was several months behind.
Okay, next item on the agenda is our study session, and that concerns the implications of SB 743 on CEQA analysis of transportation impacts and local transportation planning. Staff, maybe you have a report.
Yes, I'm going to turn over the presentation to environmental consultant extraordinaire, Mr. Lloyd Zola, who's been in Brisbane with us for a long time. So take it away, Lloyd. Thank you.
And while I can discuss the implications of the law, the one thing I cannot do is make sense of the law. So the one irony for all this to keep in mind as we talk about the law is this was sponsored by then State Senator Steinberg, who is now Mayor Steinberg in Sacramento and has to implement his own law. So I enjoy that little bit of irony. What SB 743 does is it eliminates traffic congestion as a significant impact under the California Environmental Quality Act. So for as long as we've had the law in CEQA, we have analyzed traffic. We have analyzed traffic in terms of congestion, which is what you hear from the public as their concern in traffic. And what SB 743 does is it says very simply, it's not a concern under CEQA anymore. So the way that we have analyzed traffic for years and years is looking at congestion using a measurement called level of service, LOS. And it's generally measured in 2 different ways. One is looking at, that's basically used for roadways, but can also be used for intersections, that basically just measures what % of the total capacity of this roadway, this freeway, this intersection is being utilized by traffic. We can also look at intersections in terms of delay. How many seconds do we actually wait at an intersection
on the average to get through, which is what people really experience, and that's where the irritation comes from. And all this is then goes through the calculations and is laid out in letter grades, A, B, C, D, and E. And unlike school, A is the least congestion, but not necessarily the best situation. Because when you have, for example, large roadways operating at level of service A, you have a lot of roadway, not a lot of traffic, and what happens in that situation? People drive too fast. So typically cities will set standards, most typically level of service C, as congestion gets worse and worse and get into communities and in urban situations, level of service D, looking at that balancing. The other thing to keep in mind is when we're looking at intersections, this measurement of level of service and the grade that it's given is for the peak travel hour. Peak travel hour is not 1 hour, it's actually 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. So what we talk about when we assign a level of service is what is the traffic 4 hours a day and not the rest. And so that kind of sets the stage of looking at congestion, because really what people are concerned with is when they're going to work, coming home, and the congestion that they face. Although on the 101 freeway and some other freeways you get peak hours that go far longer than just morning and afternoon. The way that Brisbane and other cities throughout the state have used level of service is you have a level of service in the general plan, and there's a standard in the general plan, and that is used to determine the number of lanes that are needed on roadways, the number, how you design intersections to carry traffic in some manner that you've just determined is an acceptable amount of delay or congestion at an intersection. It's also used in capital improvements programming when the city says, or people say, the city needs to do something about impacts and traffic at this location, and a city would look at its own level of service standards to determine whether improvements are really necessary or not based on its own standards. And what 743 addresses is utilizing, and the way it's utilized in the Environmental Quality Act and the traffic studies you see going on and prepared as part of CEQA. And what those studies do is they analyze individual projects and what amount of traffic will those projects throw out onto the streets, and where are their impacts, where is the level of service standard exceeded, and then what requirements, mitigation measures do we put on that project. And we'll talk a little bit later also about CEQA there are limitations to the Environmental Quality Act because you are analyzing a project and its impacts. So when you're analyzing a project, you may look at a project in relation to all the other projects that you might expect and background traffic and everything that would happen, but really you only can apply mitigation to that project. And what level of service is used for? Ultimately what it does is it's used to look at how do we accommodate traffic on roadways and deal with accommodating vehicular traffic and set roadway capacity to accommodate and deal with increasing amounts of traffic on our streets. And what SB 743 does is try to change that equation. And so this is the city's existing level of service standard that you see on the screen. Basically, the city uses level of service D, which is pretty typical of suburban areas, and in a couple intersections on Bayshore, looking at level of service C, which is a more typical small town, rural, and standard. And that level of service C at Bayshore Boulevard at Old County and at San Bruno. So that is the existing standard. Now, what has happened over the years is we've been using this level of service standard in CEQA for 30-something years. There are very sophisticated traffic models available to analyze impacts of projects. They work really well at projecting congestion and analyzing the impacts of projects. But there's certain things that come out of it that weren't anticipated. And these are the kinds of things that State Senator Steinberg and the people supporting the bill were trying to address. One is the irony that fixing congestion increases the amount of traffic. The easier you make it to drive, the more people do drive. And that's that kind of notion. And so that is one of the unanticipated consequences, and planning schools for years and years have taught or tried to teach you cannot build your way out of congestion. The more you add roadway capacity, the irony is the more development spreads out. You can see this in the Bay Area. Imagine the effect of taking 580 freeway, the freeway through Altamont Pass, 580, widening it, adding a whole bunch of lanes. What's the outcome? Easier to move out to Tracy. And so those are the kinds of things that weren't anticipated, but it also doesn't work the other way. If you go back to the first Jerry Brown administration, his concept was if we don't build freeways out to the suburban areas, people will not spread development out there. Well, that concept did not work out in Tracy, and if you ever fly down to Ontario Airport, there are freeways going out to the Inland Empire that were not going to get built, so that area would not develop. Didn't work. Increasing vehicular traffic tends to be an outcome of actually trying to fix traffic. The other thing that happens is because level of service addresses roadways and moving cars, one of the outcomes that was noticed is it inhibits use of transit. The more we make it easier to drive car, the less I'm inclined to get on BART. It makes it more difficult to use bicycles or pedestrian movement. You see in a lot of communities big, wide roadways and huge intersections with free right turn lanes and double left turn lanes. In order to walk across, you can make it as far as the median and then you wait for the next one. And it's uncomfortable to ride a bicycle on roadways that are a lot of traffic moving very fast. And so that's also part of that encouraging traffic. And because we're accommodating more and more cars, the concern that at the state level was increasing air quality emissions, increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and increased energy use. And one of the driving forces behind SB 743 is the push at the state level dealing with climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the state has done a lot in terms of electricity use and use of alternate fuels and so on, but transportation is one of the major, if not the major source of greenhouse gas. And so part of the reasoning behind SB 743 was we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions coming from automobiles. And so we'll explain how they're trying to do that. The last thing, and this particularly shows up in CEQA analysis, and if you look at an EIR or any traffic study, you will see this project is going to generate 5,000 vehicles per day, and these are the impacts at intersections surrounding. Every intersection is analyzed one by one. And so because that's the output of an LOS model, of a level of service model. And what it does is it focuses on individual intersections and moving vehicles and really kind of inhibits looking at a system, at a transportation system of a whole city. And so what has happened even in updating a general plan circulation element is we run a traffic model, and the model tells us here's what we need at the intersection, and we set our roadways, and there we are. But rarely do we look at, does that really work? We're letting the equations of moving traffic at individual intersections take sway. And so there are other things as this applies to Brisbane, and the standard was set in your general plan. In 1994, traffic studies were done when the general plan was adopted, looking at future traffic that resulted in the standards that are in the general plan. Two things that no one could have anticipated or thought of at the time. One is the explosion of development that would occur in San Francisco. Housing, employment, the explosion of employment that was going to occur to the south of you. in the Silicon Valley, and the huge amount of development occurring to the north and south, and traffic moving back and forth up and down the peninsula, and how much worse the 101 freeway was going to get. And the other one is this simple little app called Google Maps or Waze that tells us when to get off the freeway and take the alternate route. And because remember, years ago, before we had that nice little tool, we'd get stuck on a freeway and really debate, should I get off, should I not get off? And if you didn't know the area, no way were you getting off the freeway to go. And now we have our cell phones that tell us, get off the freeway here. And they're telling drivers on 101 when they're stuck, get off, take Bayshore Boulevard. There's no way we could have predicted that. The outcome of all of this is when you look at traffic projections for Brisbane, is there are going to be 6 intersections that are not going to meet your level of service standard that have nothing to do with your own development. Just that regional through traffic. From the north of you to the south of you, putting traffic on your street, 6 intersections will not meet your own standard. Problem is, then remember the limitation of the Environmental Quality Act. When you're analyzing your project, CEQA tells you you cannot make your project solve the regional problem. CEQA says you can make that project solve the problems it creates. And so we have that limitation to deal with also. And so what SB 743 does is this. The current traffic analysis that is required for CEQA is a measurement of level of service. And it changes it to this. One, you're not going to hear the term traffic study anymore. It's going to be a transportation study, and it's going to study vehicle miles traveled. And real simply, vehicle miles traveled is the number of vehicles on the roadway times the average trip length. The longer the trip, the more vehicle miles traveled, the more cars, the more vehicle miles traveled. So when you're in Brisbane driving back and forth between San Francisco, much shorter commute, your vehicle miles are a whole lot shorter than they would be as development is occurring out in Tracy and they're driving into Silicon Valley and into Livermore, Pleasanton to work. Longer drive, more VMT. Where you're using transit, VMT is less than where you're only using cars. It will also change the way that we mitigate impacts. So right now, when a traffic study is done in a CEQA document, our mitigation measures dealing with congestion, increase intersection capacity, increase roadway capacity, make things work for the vehicles. That is what LOS, level of service, is intended to do, and it works well for it. What SB 743 intends to do is change that mitigation. The way you reduce vehicle miles traveled is to increase use of transit, increase use of bicycles, increase pedestrian travel, and reduce the need for automobile travel, which means infill development. And it means, and you see this with the push for housing in the Bay Area. I mean, there's lots of reasons you need housing costs and so on, but it's also a greenhouse gas issue. Reduce the need for the long distance commutes. Have people in mixed-use development, in near transit, where vehicle trips are shorter, and then reduce vehicle miles traveled, which reduces greenhouse gas emissions. These requirements are effective July 1st of next year. So SB 743, the guidelines have been adopted, they are in place, and right now cities have the option of using the vehicle miles travel analyses. You still have the ability in your CEQA documents to do traditional traffic studies. July of next year, traffic congestion is not an impact anymore. So that is what VMT is trying to solve. But like any solution, it creates some new problems. So what it's trying to do, infill, reduce air quality, GHG emissions, encourage bicycle, pedestrian travel, improve public health, and looking at transportation as a multimodal system. And those are worthy goals, but there's some downsides to doing that. One is, and these are things that staff is working on now, so we come back with solutions for you. Vehicle miles traveled is not at all effective dealing with traffic congestion. The things people are concerned with, VMT does not address that. It's very indirect, the way that it would affect it. So the questions that need to be answered in a vehicle miles traveled world is, how do we deal with traffic congestion in Brisbane? Because for all the public hearings I've been to, for all the scoping meetings I've done on environmental impact reports, traffic comes up, if not first, it's right at the top of the list. And I have yet to hear somebody show up at a public hearing saying, I'm really concerned with how many vehicle miles traveled this project's going to create. So traffic as an issue, as a public concern, is not going away. We need to deal with it. And how do we then best plan for roadway improvements, because VMT is not going to give us that answer. Under the new guidelines, SB 743, it says a significant traffic impact. Right now, a significant traffic impact means exceeding that level of service threshold. What the state now says, or says as of July 1st, 2020, a significant traffic impact or transportation impact is a substantial increase in vehicle miles traveled, which is measured how? And so exactly the issue is there is not clear direction, and the state leaves that to every city to figure it out for themselves. There is a recommendation that the State Department of Office and Planning and Research has suggested, and yes, it is as confusing as it was about to sound. What the State Department, OPR, Office of Planning and Research, is suggesting is that a significant impact, VMT impact, is anything greater than 15% less than the current regional average. So if the average is, for residential, I'll just get some easy numbers, 100 vehicle miles traveled per residence per day, it actually will be less. The significance threshold would be 85, 15% less. Now that's purely a suggestion. In areas that don't have transit immediately available, that's a really difficult number to hit. And so every city and every county will need to develop its own standards. And so one of the things that staff will be bringing back to you is what is a substantial increase in vehicle miles traveled, and what is the significant impact that we would use for environmental documents. The other thing is that there are not a lot of really good analytical tools to measure vehicle miles traveled. Vehicle miles traveled you can pull out of an air quality study or greenhouse gas study, because that's a number, an intermediate part of an equation that tells you what air pollutant emissions are going to be. It's a fairly generalized number and not a very good or detailed analytical tool. Those analytical tools are being developed now. And so one of the things that staff will be looking at is, how do we measure it? I mean, because we can't just throw the numbers into or use the SF Champ model or use the traffic models that we have now. Don't necessarily get you a really good answer in terms of VMT. So those are things that we will need to deal with. The other one is, keep in mind that SB 743 addresses CEQA. And so because traffic will continue to be a concern for cities, it is not eliminated from your general plan. So you can still, as a city, use level of service to analyze traffic, analyze congestion as part of consistency with the city's general plan. And so if you remember the way that we talked about the three ways that level of service would be used, CEQA will disappear, but you would still use it in your general plan to determine roadway needs, intersection needs, how to design intersections, and for public works projects. And so you would use it to plan roadway capacity as part of multimodal system-wide transportation planning and consistency with your general plan. You just don't get to use it in environmental impact reports are part of CEQA. And that, of course, remember, occurs July of next year. The LOS standard also has, when you start applying it to certain places within Brisbane, becomes a little bit, it doesn't fit as well as it does in other places. And Bayshore Boulevard is one of those locations where LOS works intersection by intersection and can tell you what happens at individual intersections, but there's some downsides to it. One is that a lot of what occurs on Bayshore Boulevard is not traffic generated in Brisbane. You are a small city, and even with all the employment you have, you don't generate as much traffic as you see going up and down Bayshore. And so what happens, or will happen, is that as you look at LOS and level of service at individual intersections, make intersection improvements, it then takes less time to drive Bayshore Boulevard from one end of Brisbane to another end. What happens? More people get off the freeway until you reach an equilibrium of congestion. And then you fix it again and more people get off the freeway. So the big effect is it's a temporary improvement and it takes people off the freeway. And so we need to deal with that situation. The other thing is that I had mentioned the 6 intersections that will essentially fail based on your standards, and these are the ones: Geneva at Bayshore, San Bruno at Bayshore, Sierra Point Parkway ramps on the 101 freeway, Lagoon and Tunnel, Lagoon and Sierra Point, Beatty and Alana Way. So what's the common denominator? Bayshore Boulevard freeway ramps, and where people are getting off to get to Bayshore, where they're getting back on. So we look at that, and the other thing that happens is the way that LOS is measured does a really interesting thing. Remember we talked about delay at an intersection. Average is delay at an intersection. So if you have a lot of regional through traffic going north and south on Bayshore, and you've got people coming out in small numbers, now in small numbers, at San Bruno trying to make a left turn onto Bayshore, doesn't do it. And so the way that LOS measures is average delay at the intersection. And if you don't have a lot of people making that left turn, basically what LOS tells you is it is not worth stopping the traffic on Bayshore Boulevard to accommodate the left-hand turn. Or put fairly crudely, it's not worth stopping the regional through traffic on Bayshore Boulevard so people in Brisbane can get onto their own roadway. And so these are the kinds of things that we want, that LOS doesn't help us with. And put together, now I'll explain the package that we're looking at to try and deal with this. One is to develop those thresholds of significance for vehicle miles traveled along with the analytical tools. State law requires us to do that, and requires the city also to replace level of service analysis, replace congestion analysis in CEQA documents. That will be occurring over the next little more than a year. The second part is that the general plan LOS standard works really well for intersections not affected by this regional through traffic. And so given the concern with traffic in the community, we believe that the standard ought to be kept for those intersections. When we get to Bayshore Boulevard and some of those turns, and some of the turning movements and the through movements, discussions with planning staff as well as with public works staff said what we really ought to look at is not intersection by intersection, but we should do a plan for the entirety of Bayshore Boulevard and all of the turning movements and all of the movements, and looking at the question, not just how do we make the equation work at individual intersections, how do we create mobility for our own residents and businesses? And so we would look at or suggest considering a multimodal plan for Bayshore Boulevard that would look at moving automobiles, mobility within the Brisbane community so people can get onto and off of Bayshore, onto and off of the freeway easily, but also looking at functions in terms of bicycle, pedestrian, and other kinds of movement along Bayshore. You know, should we consider, for example, bus rapid transit and 2 bus lanes down the middle? Lots of different ideas on what we might be able to do. And the second part is doing plans are really nice on roadways, but unless we come up with a plan to implement them, we get a plan up on a shelf. So the idea would be a multimodal plan for Bayshore Boulevard that looks at mobility for Brisbane residents and businesses, as well as moving the regional through traffic, and then a set of development requirements and a fee program or something that actually puts those improvements in place and actually funds the improvements. Because remember, the limitation under CEQA that we have right now is we can look at the impacts of individual developments. We can't fix the big problem because it's only looking at that project by project, intersection by intersection. This allows doing that multimodal plan to look at how do we get mobility, what is the plan, how do we pay for it, how do we get it in place, rather than taking fair share for individual intersections from individual developers. So there it is. That's, yeah, it's a major change in the law, and communities all throughout the state are struggling with this concept. So I'd be glad to take any questions. I know that's a lot to throw at you all at one time.
Thank you very much. Anybody have questions? Commissioner Mackin.
Lloyd, thank you. Nice to see you here.
Thank you.
So, SB 743 sounds textbook, great plan on paper, implementation fraught with many difficulties. First of which, a really obvious one, and I'll just take the last slide that you have up. Implementation. Multimodal mobility plan for Bayshore. Since connectivity is required between different communities, we deal with one project. You say you could have funding from a particular development to implement a mobility plan, but that's like making a railroad track that goes through your town and then it stops at the city limits.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see anything in SB 743 that addresses regional coordination, and I don't see how this can be implemented.
Yeah.
Has anything?
Yes, it's there, but again, it's partly indirect. First, the regional coordination occurs in terms of the measurement of vehicle miles traveled aimed at infill development, higher intensity, mixed use, transit-oriented development, transit improvements, bicycle improvements, and so on, all of which would be consistent with the regional transportation plan, with the sustainable community strategies in place for the region. And so in the Bay Area, we have Plan Bay Area that lays out priority development areas, transportation systems, and so the idea of 743 is to change the equation from building roadways as mitigation measures to implementing those essentially GHG reduction strategies. So that's the regional coordination. What it really does remove in terms of regional coordination is in terms of roadways. That just disappears, because theoretically, under the level of service system that we've had all these years, when you develop a project, consider a project, you do a traffic study, and it has traffic impacts in San Francisco or Daly City or South City, and we require the project to mitigate those impacts in other communities. There's limitations in CEQA and so on. However, under 743, if you're not measuring congestion, you certainly aren't measuring traffic congestion impacts in other communities. So, but keep in mind, 743 is underlying it. It's about moving people out of their cars and onto transit, or more efficient land use so people aren't driving. And you will hear at times almost a thought that says, and it's never really specific, but it's kind of underlying there. You kind of hear it whispering in your ear. As traffic congestion gets worse and worse, it's actually not a bad thing, because more people will use transit, and then we have greenhouse gas improvements. And that's part of the theory. Not surprising. This was, again, go back to Jerry Brown's first term. One of the concepts that was used: if we don't build roadways, people will use transit, more efficient land use. 743 is a much more sophisticated way at it. But on the other hand, the imperative is dealing with climate change. We have to address greenhouse gas emissions from automobile travel. There's no way we hit the reductions we need without getting to automobile travel. And so this is really not a people forgetting about the implementation. This is a change in priorities, and it's a radical change in priorities from road building to emphasizing efficient land uses so people don't have to use cars and use of transit.
It's just, I mean, I could go poking all the holes in it, but we have 50% increase in traffic on 101 with Uber and Lyft cars over the past 4 years, documented.
Oh yeah, there is
50% is huge.
Yes.
So are you going to get them out of the cars? Because those are a lot of times single occupancy use vehicles. So but then also part of this is troubling in that, say you work in Palo Alto, and say you work there because you want to work for Stanford because you have a really good job, it pays you a lot. So maybe there's some infill housing there, but it's going to be small. So you want to live in Stockton, where you have a family and you can have a backyard, and it's more amenable. You're not going to give that up. And these are facts we know over and over. This is a problem. Or you can't even afford a small place in Palo Alto. So maybe you're living in Livermore and you're commuting. That's not going to stop. But the worst of all, and I agree totally with this, that people have to get out of cars, and the worse the traffic is, they're going to, myself included. I love Amazon. I don't want to get in the car. It's already working for me. But if I have to go somewhere, public transit, great. And I've been doing that for years. But we're taking away the parking at the BART stations. The Caltrain is packed to the gills. Samtrans doesn't even run every 15 minutes, and sometimes they don't show up on the 30 minutes. So we don't have the transit. It's like having the cart without the horse. How do they expect this to work without the public transit?
The other part of it is looking at statewide transportation funding that has been moving money from roadway building into transit, and so that move has been going. The other part of it is federal government is busy undoing that statewide priority, but that's another story. The idea of the mitigation requirements that start funding transit improvements, that fund bicycle improvements, that would fund pedestrian improvements, are aimed at moving at least developer impact mitigation money from roadway into transit. It is intended to also affect patterns of development. The more it becomes difficult to provide mitigation for vehicle miles traveled theoretically in Stockton and Modesto and Tracy there, the more that infill development, developers will then move towards infill development where you don't have those kinds of CEQA concerns. Another part of it is the transit agencies look at, one of the things that the transit agencies, some are considering or setting up mitigation banks, very similar to biological mitigation banks, where you set aside habitat and then developers buy into that. So the concept would be I'll use BART as an example. If BART needs to expand capacity, because part of 743 is aimed at sending all sorts of people, at BART, and we know how crowded BART stations can get. And so if BART needs to expand its stations just to accommodate more people, if it needs to expand maintenance yards, they could actually do an analysis that would say these improvements will cost X amount of dollars. If we spend that X amount of dollars, we can then increase capacity on our system by this much, put a dollar fee to it, and now a developer who needs mitigation for transit could actually pay their fair share, not for expanding a roadway, but for expanding BART. This is all theory, and unfortunately the way, and you've caught it, the way the law works is they've changed the priority, and now the rest, we've all been left with figuring out how to make this work.
And if I may, one last question, I'll be quick. Give someone else a chance here. When you talk about developing tools to perform this new analysis, do you expect legal challenges to those? Because if every community is developing their own set of tools without a uniform guideline, then doesn't that also set?
This has been a big debate, and you look at litigation regarding CEQA documents now. A lot of it is related to traffic. And the state and the proponents of SB 743 have said by eliminating traffic as a CEQA impact, it will simplify the process and there will be less litigation. I think all we got to do is look at, we've had the requirements for analyzing greenhouse gases now for how many years, and we're still litigating the appropriate way of analyzing it. So I think just in this state, the way we litigate as a means of opposing development, litigation is one of the tools we use to oppose a project. You show up at public hearing, and then if you don't like the outcome, you go litigate the environmental document. I think there will be litigation until this all sorts out. There will be situations where a city adopts a threshold and uses one analytical tool. The adjacent city will use a different threshold with a different analytical tool, and you'll find varying different results. And it will eventually sort itself out, but yeah, there may be a lot of litigation. And there will, not necessarily a lot, there'll be a couple landmark cases. It's just the way any change in CEQA has occurred.
And just to point out, traffic modeling today is not immune. This is not a perfect science as it is, the same sort of imperfections of modeling, and it's ripe for litigation, in its current state of LOS. It's not like that is a perfect science that everyone agrees in all cases. The modeling there has its own sort of, if you go back and compare how an intersection functions from how it was modeled the intersection, or how it was modeled to perform, good luck finding what the degree of accuracy of some of that old modeling is.
Yeah, in fact, there was just a lawsuit filed in San Bernardino County challenging a traffic study because use any model, it takes a series of inputs, which are assumptions on the way the project will work. They challenge the assumptions that went into that were put into the analytical tool. So 30 years of traffic modeling in San Bernardino County, we're still litigating.
Anyone else?
Okay, can I ask one more?
Sure.
Okay, so peak hours. They're still using 4 hours a day?
It's typically the two highest hours in the morning and 2 in the afternoon.
Because that's not realistic anymore.
No, I know. And what happens, and I live in a community that's the classic of this, the freeway, the 91 freeway through Riverside County is so far over capacity you couldn't put another car on at a peak hour. But so what happens is as new development occurs, the peak hour just gets longer and longer and longer, and you've seen that. You get up to go to work, you get on the roadway at 5:30 in the morning, and it's already backed up.
Right.
And it stays that way till 9:30, 10 o'clock, or keeps going on. But yeah, peak hour measures the two highest hours.
So could we as a community with these tools say 2 hours morning and afternoon is not realistic for us.
Yeah, the idea of getting away, and one thing you can do in getting away from the traditional level of service is you can look at how it functions differently. But you know, one of the things we've seen, and Irvine is kind of the classic of this, with all their employment, all their housing, traffic actually functions pretty well in peak hour because they have 8-lane roadways with double left turns in every direction, double free right turns and all these things. And then you go look at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and there's nobody on the roadway. And you have these massive roadways that they have to maintain being used really only a couple hours a day. The idea is in looking at a plan, you can actually look at how is that roadway used throughout the day, how does it really function, as opposed to being stuck with the equations that go. So maybe it makes sense to look at longer periods of time, maybe not, and those are things that can be looked at with your public works director as we start. If that's the direction ultimately we decide, is let's do a reasonable plan, figure out what we can do.
Commissioner Gooding?
I have one question, and it's really about, to educate me about what the statute really says. As I understand it, sort of currently, the LOS uses, as a study metric, uses peak hour, because it's sort of how the intersection maxes out. Does the new statute also try to talk about peak hours, or is it just VMT for that whole
day
street for the whole day?
Yeah, it's daily. And some models are, you could look at daily, you can look at per year. So that way you get evening, you get weekend peaks. So if you're looking at, if you're in Carmel, it doesn't make sense to do it only on a weekday.
Right. So they are really looking at the whole totality of traffic.
Yeah, it's theoretically totality of traffic, but there's one major exception in the VMT rule, which are trucks. And so the warehousing industry and the big 18-wheelers, Prologis, and you go down to Ontario, Rancho Cucamonga, Fontana area, those are not subject to VMT analysis. And the reason for that is, imagine a warehouse. How in the world could you reduce VMT of your truck travel? Mm-hmm. So requirements for warehousing and industry to reduce greenhouse gases are just going to be different because it can't really be accommodated through vehicle miles traveled.
So bottom line, going to VMT is all about getting people out of cars.
It's all about getting people out of cars. It's about driving less. Getting them out of the cars, driving less. So another strategy is one that you've been doing in this county a long time with the transportation demand management. Going from, getting people out of their single car, getting carpools, reduces VMT. 4 people driving 1 mile, in separate cars, 4 VMT. 4 people driving together, reduces it by 75%. So it's a suite of actions, but it's driving less. That's what this is all about.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so next is items initiated by staff.
I just have 2 items. One is, as the chair mentioned, the next community conversation on May 4th, and hopefully we'll get several commissioners attended the last session in March, and I certainly hope we get the same or more attendance. I think it was a really worthwhile exercise, and so I'd encourage you all to attend if possible. There's information on that online, and I did hand out the little card. And then the other thing is the county, the 21 Elements sponsored planning commissioner workshop is next Tuesday evening, April 30th. So I don't know how many of the commissioners have signed up for that, but I certainly would encourage as many of you to make it as possible. If you do want to sign up and you haven't yet, just get a hold of me and I'll make sure you are put on the list. So I look forward to seeing, I'll be attending as well, so look forward to seeing whoever next Tuesday evening.
Could I briefly put in here, do you have any more of the cards I could pass around the neighborhood?
I do have some more cards,
Great.
yes.
Okay, next is items initiated by the commission. There are none. So may I have a motion to adjourn until our next meeting of May 9th, 2019?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.